Let me try that again. Good morning or good afternoon to you, depending on where you're coming to us uh, from today. My name is Justin Peter. I'm the host of today's event, today's webinar, and I'm one of the owners and directors of Worldwide Quest. We are a small travel company based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I'll tell you more about us in a couple of moments. First, I wanted to simply mention that you should be seeing a slide right now, a slide below my face. If you don't see that, that's our title slide of today's presentation, which is of course the penguins, the planet's perfect predators. If you see me, but you don't see the slide, you should notice below my head the gray frame of the window, and at the bottom, basically centered on that window, there should be three little horizontal parallel lines. If you click on that little button at center, the slide should pop down below my head, below the location where you should be seeing the speakers. So please try that if you don't see the slide. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event with Catherine Jardine. Today's event is presented as part of a series of Antarctica-themed presentations or webinars that we've been hosting here at Worldwide Quest. It's possible that you heard about today's event through one of our partnering organizations. We partner as Worldwide Quest, we partner with a number of university alumni associations, including the ones that you see here: McGill, USask, Western, McMaster, York, University of Guelph, and University of Alberta, and Alumni UBC, to present travel experiences for alumni, travelers, and friends. We specialize in small group educational trips on all 7 continents, featuring interesting study leaders who are thought leaders in their respective areas. So you can travel having a chance to see the sites, but also learn much more about the place and get context and insights. So today's presentation is in the context of that. In fact, we have a group tour for all those sponsoring university alumni associations in Canada to Antarctica this coming fall from October 24th to November 13th. It's called Epic Antarctica with the Falklands and South Georgia. And I'll just skip ahead back to that slide. This is a little bit of a larger expedition. I'll tell you more about it later following today's presentation, but it's a chance for us to explore 3 distinct areas of the Southern Ocean region, experiencing each place, but getting really the full context for the location, how those pieces match together or fit together. And in fact, on this expedition, we will have study leaders, these 3 study leaders from 3 of the participating university alumni associations: Philippe Tortel, who's an oceanographer and also botanist at University of British Columbia, representing Alumni UBC. He'll be telling us about ocean productivity. We also have Bruno Tremblay, also an oceanographer, but focusing on the geophysical environment, coming to us from McGill, who will tell us about how polar ice affects the climate, and how the climate in turn affects polar ice. And also Brent St. Clair, who is a biologist from University of Western Ontario, and he'll be telling us about the microfauna, that's invertebrates that live in the polar regions. And in fact, these 3 speakers have presented webinars for us in the past. Today's webinar is presented by one of our Worldwide Quest staff naturalists, Catherine Jardine, who is an ornithologist, and I'll welcome Catherine to join us in just a couple of moments. Today's presentation should be lasting about 35 to 40 minutes, followed with a question period. And I'll also note that we have a questions tab in your console. You should see a little questions tab, and that's a place where you'll be welcome to enter your questions later for Catherine. I think it's possible my camera is not functioning anymore. It seems to have frozen. Oh, there I am again. So you'll have the questions tab there into which you can plug your questions for Catherine. Now, of course, Catherine today is talking about penguins. They're irretrievably linked, or certainly associated in our minds with polar regions, with the southern polar region of Antarctica and the subantarctic. I can tell you a little bit more about Catherine. Catherine is an very avid naturalist and traveler who follows her remarkable interests in wildlife and landscapes around the world. She's a superlative communicator of the natural world, as our travelers on our last Antarctic voyage for alumni have discovered. Catherine works as a staff ornithologist during the day with Birds Canada, which is Canada's leading bird science and conservation association. Her research focuses on large-scale data sets as a means to answer questions about bird ecology. Now, Catherine has worked as a field biologist on multiple different projects, including surveys of seabirds such as puffins on remote islands. She's also worked with endangered bird species such as the brown kiwi in New Zealand, and kakapo, that's a very large flightless parrot that lives in New Zealand. She's also worked as an expedition guide in Antarctica. She has a particular interest in seabirds, hence our discussion with Catherine about penguins today. And she grounds her interpretive style in an understanding of the region's ecology, providing really a big picture so we can place wildlife in its proper context. Catherine is fantastic, really, at engaging people in the wonders of the natural world. She also likes a good pun, as we may learn today. Catherine, are you there? Hello, Catherine. Welcome to today's event, and we're so glad to have you on board. And I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Justin. I do enjoy a good pun. I hope that is all right with everyone. Hopefully you're able to see my screen here. So today we're going to be talking about penguins. So you can see here the title slide has a bunch of king penguins. So these are not emperor penguins, these are king penguins. The emperors are a little bit rarer to see, as you would have seen in that video that Justin showed to introduce this webinar. The one funny part of that video that I also wanted to share with you is that when that happened, Chris sort of locked eyes with me when he saw that emperor penguin. I ran to the bridge of the ship to get them to turn the boat around so that everybody could see this penguin. And the first officer looked at me, he's like, "Catherine, the captain is asleep. How sure are you?" And the benefit of us having chartered the vessel was that we could say, "We're sure, wake the captain up." And the captain woke up and he was like, "This better not be a Gentoo penguin," and turned around, and we got to see that wonderful emperor. So that was a very, very exciting moment for everybody. And I think the reason why it was an exciting moment for everybody is because penguins really do have a special place in our heart, right? We love to love penguins. There's just something about them. They sort of put a smile on your face, right? They're cute, but they're also a little derpy, maybe a little clumsy sometimes, slightly awkward. And I think sometimes we look at penguins with a little bit of like maternal or paternal condensation, right? Oh, we're looking at these penguins and are like, oh, how did evolution ever produce such a ponderous, portly penguin, right? And I think that we sort of watch these penguins trying to make it on land, and we judge them in that environment. Today, I'm aiming to contradict this. My goal today is to convince you that this is a lean, mean killing machine. It is, while cute, a predator that is perfectly adapted to its ecological niche. So what is that niche? So here on this map, you'll see the distribution of all the world's penguins. They inhabit the southern hemisphere only, just at the equator and south. And the reason is that they are really cold water specialists. If we look at their distribution next to the global sea surface temperature, which you can see here, where areas in blue are colder, you can see that the penguin distribution really follows those blue cold areas. Even the Galapagos penguins that inhabit this area up in the region to the north, they're following this cold water current that's coming up this coast of South America. And this cold water upwelling around South Africa is where we'll see African penguins, and these cold water upwellings in New Zealand and Australia. So there you have it. I am an amazing naturalist. I've told you that penguins like cold water, but I think we can go a little bit deeper into that and ask why. So anybody slogging through the Arctic outflow we had last week or living through -40 in Alberta, the cold can be pretty miserable. So here's a photo of a bunch of Adelie penguins that I took in a snowstorm in the height of summer. This is the warmest time in the Antarctic, and these penguins were raising their chicks in the snow here. So if my thesis for you guys is that penguins are brilliant, why are they doing something so foolish? Why live like this? Why not just move up to the Amazon and bask in the sun? Well, the answer comes in when we think about ocean currents. And I won't get deep into this, that's my first pun, because that's for Philippe and the oceanographers to talk about. But the short answer is that cold waters tend to be productive waters. In these cold waters, we get these upwellings. So you have these deep ocean currents that are meeting land and upwelling towards the surface. And when they upwell, they bring nutrients with them. This graph is a little bit hard to interpret, but we'll go over it together. So at the bottom here, you have the degrees across the planet. So the equator is in the middle, and the Arctic Circle is on the right, and the Antarctic Circle is on the left. And then what you're seeing here is the amount of nitrate in the water. And if anybody is a gardener here, you know that nitrogen, nitrate, is a fertilizing chemical. And what we see is we're seeing this upwelling in both the Arctic and the Antarctic of that fertilizing chemical coming towards the surface. And of course, the surface is where the sun is penetrating the water. You can see this purple area in the middle, so that's the equator and the temperate regions, very low in nitrogen at the surface. There's sort of this cap that is preventing any of this deep water nitrogen from coming to the surface here. It's only really coming to the surface in areas near the poles, in the Arctic and Antarctic. And those nutrients fertilize algae. An algae might not be as cute as penguins, but it forms the basis of the marine food web. So this picture is actually some of the algae we retrieved during our last trip. We did an algae trawl and looked at these algae under the microscope. And because these are the primary producers, then we know that lots of algae means lots of zooplankton and lots of fish. We can see this when we look at chlorophyll production across the world. So this map shows you areas of high chlorophyll production. And chlorophyll is a compound that's made by plants, and it is an index of the productivity of the ocean. So if there's lots of chlorophyll, that means there's lots of algae. It means there's lots of food. That means there's lots of zooplankton. That means there's lots of fish. And you can really see these high concentrations in the northern hemisphere here and in the southern hemisphere here. Lots of chlorophyll in the water. So where there's a resource like that, it tends to attract predators. And in the north, we get our alcids. These are our auks, puffins, guillemots, murres. And in the south, we have penguins. They are both groups of diving birds that look incredibly similar, and you'd think that they were related. But these are actually not related at all. That's not the case. These groups are not closely related in the slightest. They have just experienced convergent evolution. And that means that they've had similar selection pressures to take advantage of these rich polar waters, and therefore have evolved similar adaptations. But they're not related. In fact, there was an alcid, an auk, called the great auk in North America. It was in the Maritimes areas of Canada, that was actually flightless. And unfortunately, the great auk was driven to extinction with the arrival of Europeans in North America because it was so easily hunted, because it was flightless. but they're not related closely at all, even though they were both flightless black and white diving birds. Puffins evolved relatively recently, being most closely related to gulls. You can see the auks here and their cousins, the gulls and the terns, whereas the penguins are more closely related to albatrosses and petrels. So quite distinct, those two groups. And in fact, the penguins are very old lineage. The earliest ancestors of penguins began branching off more than 85 million years ago. And by around 66 million years ago, as you can see here, there was a proto-penguin that was not incredibly different than today. So as ridiculously and endearing as they are also persevering. And they have ruled the Southern Ocean for millions of years. And that's a good reminder to respect our elders, right? So most of the North American auks, the ones that are more closely related to gulls, have retained their ability to fly. That's likely due to more inaccessible nesting sites. Most of these are cliff nesters and a higher density of predators. However, they don't fly particularly well. They're not to knock puffins or anything. I love them, but their wings are fairly short, and that is important because if you're going to flap your wings underwater, you need them to be quite short to reduce drag. Really long wings underwater would produce too much drag and would slow you down. In that case, because they have such short wings, they have to beat their wings very, very frequently. So these have high wing loading, very small wings to heavy weight, and a puffin will have to beat its wings 600 times per minute just to stay airborne. In the south, where the winds are very strong and predators are few and nest sites are all have very high walkability scores, penguins, instead of being a jack of both trades, trying to balance flying and diving, they're a master of just one bunch of their different diving adaptations. How do they do this? How are these warm-blooded birds able to survive and thrive in these cold oceans? For example, emperor penguins can dive down to 400 meters below the surface and can stay down for up to 30 minutes. And that's huge for an animal that's small, right? That's a long time underwater. So we're going to talk about some of their adaptations for foraging in these waters. The first is their body plan. So penguins have their legs very far back on their body. They are very streamlined. Their feet, instead of being in the middle of their body like this duck here, where they would have their tail and their head balanced on either side of their feet, they have moved towards the back of their body. And that allows for less drag, and they lets them use their feet to steer. So penguins are shaped like torpedoes. I should actually more accurately say that torpedoes are shaped like penguins, right? Because penguins came first. However, that transition of the feet from the middle of the body to far back of their body has led to that upright stance, and they're somewhat precarious balance on land. However, it still has some advantages. So let's talk a little bit about penguin locomotion. This is a video that I took on our last quest trip of a couple of gentoos walking towards me at a place called Danko Harbor. And when penguins walk, their top of their body wobbles back and forth, right? They waddle. It's a penguilum, right? Pendulum. But they are only using energy to rotate a bit with each step. When we walk, we have to lift our body weight up, take a step, and then stop, and lift our body weight up and take a step and then stop. Because we are doing this and we're not acting like a pendulum, we're not recovering as much energy from our walk. Penguins are able to recover about 80% of all the energy that they expend by doing this rotation around a pivot point. Whereas we, as humans, also a bipedal organism, only recover about 65%. So penguins are about 20% more efficient than us than walking. And penguins are not all that concerned about walking. Even if they might occasionally have a few slips, emperors are famous for their march across the ice, right? And gentoo penguins have been recorded nesting as much as 8 kilometers inland. That means they're walking 8 kilometers between the ocean and their nest on every foraging trip. So it doesn't actually impede them that much. We can see here that we have the skeletal structure of a penguin here on the right. You can see those legs are actually quite long inside the body cavity there. And what other thing you might notice here is this bone on the front, this very, very large keel. So this is the bone where birds' flight muscles usually attach. So these are where their breast muscles attach, and it's quite large and fused so that it can provide support as birds flap their wings to fly. A lot of times in flightless birds, the keel becomes incredibly reduced. You can see this on this kiwi here that has a very, very tiny, tiny itty bitty keel. And that's because a kiwi doesn't have a lot of flight feathers because it doesn't fly, right? So it doesn't need that attachment mechanism, and that bone is reduced. Whereas the penguin has a huge keel, and that's because it's flapping underwater. Huge amount of resistance from that water in order for it to flap, and they have this very strong keel to allow them to do that. They also have these fused short wings. Again, to reduce drag, their wings are very, very short, but the bones are very flattened and strong. So their flippers are very, very, very stable. And their bones are very dense. Unlike most birds that have hollow bones to reduce weight and allow for flight, penguins have solid bones. That reduces buoyancy and improves their ability to dive, and also makes them pretty robust, which they sometimes need when they are moving from the water onto land. There can be some interesting navigation of waves and rocks in those cases. And on land, when they fall over, it means they're not particularly fragile. So they're prepared for that. The other thing that you might know about penguins is that they are black and white. And this is a pretty common pattern in ocean creatures. And it's not for a gala event, but it is for camouflage. These are predators. They need to hide and stalk their prey. Counter shading allows them to blend in. So this is a Galapagos penguin, looking down from above and up from below. Funnily enough, this is the only species that I could find good underwater shots for it easily. Shocking that that might be true in the Galapagos and not for some of the more southern penguins. But this counter shading allows them to blend in, right? As you're looking down against the bottom of the depths, they are hidden from the surface, and as you're looking up, they blend in with the light from above. And they also have other benefits of this counter shading. They can use this to thermoregulate. They can turn their backs towards the sun when they're cold, and the sun will warm those black feathers and help keep them warm. And if they're hot, they can turn their white bellies towards the sun, and that helps cool them. And then pigments in the black feathers make these feathers stronger, and so their backs can withstand more of the elements when they're lying on their bellies or incubating. So good reasons why they're black and white. And those feathers are very, very specialized. So they have not had to have flight feathers. They need to have diving feathers. And the feathers on their wings are very, very short, and they're called imbricate feathers. And they almost look more like lizard scales than bird feathers. So at the top panel here, you can see how light from the air moves through a human eye and focuses directly back on the back of the eye here, where it is picked up by the brain and becomes a photo, an image. Whereas on the right, you can see that the penguin actually is nearsighted. Penguins are nearsighted on land. So that's why you'll often see them wobbling their heads around, trying to get a better read on something far away, like us, and why they actually use sound to locate each other in the colonies, which is why their colonies are quite noisy places, because they don't have the best vision. They have excellent hearing and are able to identify their chick or their parent just by sound, but their sight on land, not so great. That's because penguins is one of the rare vertebrates with a flattened cornea. So as you can see underwater, we have blurry vision, right? That's because light bends differently in water than it does in air, and it focuses actually behind our eye. Whereas a penguin underwater is focused. And so they have, again, adapted fully to living in the ocean. A king penguin, for example, has a crazy pupil that is able to adjust brightness to the darkness of the ocean as they dive to hunt. In fact, the areas of their pupil can change an amazing 300-fold. So their pupil can go from incredibly wide underwater to on land, it's just a teeny tiny little dot in the bright light of the day. And that is more than any other bird species known. That changed from 300 down to 1. So huge ability to see under the water. The final adaptation that we'll talk about for penguins in the water is the fact that they are chubby. So this is an Adelie that was looking quite rotund at one of our stops last year. Water is a heat sink, right? It has 20 times the cooling power of air. So penguins have to have thick layers of insulating blubber and feathers to keep warm. And one of the things that this does is reduces their surface area to volume ratio. Right? And you all intuitively know this. When you're hot, you like lay out and sit like this and try and increase your surface area to volume ratio to let more space for the heat to radiate from your body. When you're cold, you do this, right? You try and make yourself as small as possible. You're trying to increase your surface area to volume ratio. So the more round you are, the lower your surface area to volume ratio, the less heat you lose to your environment. And so even though it's really, really cute, that chubbiness is incredibly adaptive. They also have these thick feathers to keep warm, as we've seen. And we really haven't invented anything better than feathers for insulating, right? A lot of us are still using down coats, and those are incredibly popular as a means of staying warm because there's nothing that we have created that is as insulating and as light as feathers. Birds are still the masters there. But they have these thick coats of feathers, but then they also have these naked feet. So how is this an adaptation? Like I'm telling you how great penguins are, how do these feet help them? Because obviously they're sitting on the ice with these feet, they're in the ocean with these feet. How does not all the heat escape from their feet? Well, the answer is countercurrent exchange. So instead of losing their heat from their feet, they are able to have the heat kept in their body. And how that works is the warm blood that is flowing from their body to their feet is pressed right up against the vein that is taking the blood from their feet back into their body. So the heat between the vein that's coming in and the artery that's going out is being transferred. So the warmest blood is against the warmest blood, and the coldest blood is against the coldest blood here. So we get this temperature differential that allows them to keep most of the heat in their body. We actually use a similar system in a lot of heating and cooling systems because we are trying to maintain heat or coolness in a certain area. And so we can actually see, if we look at a thermal projection, a thermal camera on a penguin, you can see a warm spot around its face and around its armpit here, but the feet are the same color as sort of the environment around it and the outside of these feathers where it's nice and cool and insulated. So they're able to allow their feet to drop well below their core body temperature. And they actually have proteins that act as antifreeze in those feet to prevent them from freezing and experiencing damage. In the extreme heat, they can actually do the opposite. So this is a hot penguin. This is a penguin that it is unhappy because it is too hot. And you can see those white hot feet there, right? They're flushing blood into their feet to help cool the rest of their body. So you could look at this and say to yourself, well, penguins pretty much have it made, right? They seem like everything is perfect to spend their time in the water, and they are perfectly adapted to their environment, except until it comes time to make a new penguin. Like all of the birds, penguins lay eggs, and you can't incubate an egg in the water. So they have to return to land for that, which is where the majority of our interactions with them happen. So when we compare mammals to birds for parental care, we see that mammals, the young can be incubated at sea, right? Placental mammals can carry their young in the uterus and grow them to a certain size, even while they're out and foraging and living at sea. Whereas birds, they have to lay an egg and incubate it on land until it hatches. And young can soon be left alone because they've had that prior incubation period inside their mothers, whereas birds, they need a lot of warmth and protection until they are older. The mammals can produce milk to feed their young, whereas birds have to carry food for their young. So I think of this as like mammals have batteries, whereas birds have pockets, right? They can only bring in a little bit at a time. They can't store energy for long periods. And then females for mammals can often raise young alone, but for birds, they have to trade off with one another to incubate and feed. So I don't have time today for a super deep dive into penguin breeding ecology because it's fascinating and interesting, and that's a topic for another day. But what I can say is that anybody looking at a penguin colony can't help but come to the conclusion that this is a very incredibly successful group of birds. I took this penguin. I did not take a penguin, I promise. I took this picture during our last Antarctic trip with Quest. So this is St. Andrews Bay, which is one of the largest king penguin colonies on the planet. And by some estimates, it's the largest flock of birds by weight on the planet. It hosts 200,000 pairs. So that's 400,000 penguins plus young. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find another group of predator that is quite so large. Like I can't picture 200,000 lions all coming together and living in a colony, right? So really, the next time you look at a sleepy penguin on land and think about how cute it is, just remember that these tenacious little birds are really the terror of the Southern Ocean, and they have been for tens of millions of years. They are the perfect bird, right? They survived one of the greatest extinction events our planet has ever seen, right? The extinction event 65 million years ago. You know who didn't survive that? These guys, right? So I think you have to ask yourself, who's truly the ultimate predator here? And with that, I will say thank you and take some questions.
Great, Catherine. Thank you so much for that. And if you could just hold on a second here. I'm just going to do a little transfer here.
No problem.
Yeah, great. That was super, super interesting, Catherine. And
that's not me. That's just the penguins.
Very, very interesting. Just 1 second. Oh, I'm not sure if you see me. Am I there?
I see you.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Oh, you disappeared.
Okay, we'll try again in a second here. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. That was a fantastic introduction. And I'll admit that I've seen a presentation to that effect in the past from you before, but each time I have to say this, the second time around, or maybe third, I feel like I've learned something new. Like there's something else that stuck with me because now since that time of your previous presentation, I have had a chance to observe penguins more closely on land, looking for some of those things that you've mentioned. So it's like there's always another opportunity to learn.
As soon as you put them in their habitat and start looking about how they behave there and their adaptations to that habitat, it opens up so many more interesting things about them. Like there's so many layers to ecology.
Yes, just amazing. Now, of course, we will be hoping to see many of the species you've talked about today, especially those king penguins in that giant colony, hopefully on South Georgia, which is a major feature of our trip coming up this fall. Before we get there, we do have time for some questions. And if you have any questions, you'll notice there is a line that says questions in your GoToWebinar console, that little vertical rectangle. So you may pop that out and write your question in there for Catherine. And I'm going to be fielding them to her starting now. I'm just going to have to read these here. Oh, I have a question from Kimber. I think we may know Kimber from the last
Kimber, hi.
Kimber from the last expedition last year, or in 2022. Hi, Kimber. Welcome back. Kimber's curiosity never ends. The question from Kimber is: I saw on a penguin skeleton, probably one that we saw, that the ribs look hinged or jointed. Does this have to do with withstanding or with having to withstand deep pressure?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Yeah, because we see very similar things with seals and sea lions, right? They have, instead of a sternum, they have a sternobra. They have a cartilage structure in their chests that actually allows their lungs to collapse at depth. And that lung collapse prevents them from getting the bends because they don't have air in their lungs that then can be absorbed into their blood at pressure. There's been less diving physiology work done on penguins. We do see that they do have a little bit more ability to be compressed compared to a lot of other birds that have a more rigid rib cage. But in terms of a lot of studies done on deep diving physiology of penguins, I know of less that have actually looked at whether or not their lungs allow them to actually have the same adaptation that seals do. The one thing about birds is they have a very different breathing system than mammals do. So mammals are tidal breathers. We breathe in and we breathe out, as any yoga instructor will have ever told you, right? But with birds, they actually have different air chambers throughout their body. And when they breathe in, the air goes into some anterior chambers or posterior chambers, then through the lungs and then out. So penguins are really well poised to have their air stored in different areas of their body outside of their lungs. And that rib cage that you observed could very well be related.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that.
Also, hi,
Catherine.
Kimber. We miss you.
And I'm just going to take a second to make a public service announcement that, of course, this webinar is being recorded. So if for some reason you need to leave now or early, you will be receiving a recording to this webinar. Also, we're going to provide a bonus. We're going to provide the recording to Catherine's webinar from 2 years ago on flighted seabirds, that's albatross and other seabirds. So watch for that in your email. We also have a couple of door prizes at today's event following the question period. So I think you should stick around. Now we'll get to other questions here for Catherine. Aldous is asking, how can zoos help with the preservation and conservation of penguin species, and what role can they provide?
This has been something that's been very important for African penguins, also known as jackass penguins because they sound like a donkey. They have a captive breeding program in zoos around the world. Penguins will breed in captivity, and they are hoping to use that as a bit of a genetic bank for the African penguin, which is one of the most endangered penguin species. They have had a lot of troubles with overfishing of their prey stocks around southern Africa, and unfortunately they were hit very hard by avian influenza last year and had very high mortality in those colonies. So zoos and aquaria that have those species in captivity are hoping to help with the breeding and reintroduction of some of those species to help bolster the wild population. So that's probably the main one that is the most important. A lot of the other penguin species at the moment are fairly secure. There are some, like the Fiordland crested penguin, that is listed because it has small population sizes. Yellow-eyed penguin, small population sizes, really restricted range. Those ones are around southern New Zealand. But the rest, the king penguins, like most of the gentoos, chinstraps, and adeles, we are seeing some declines of them. And the emperor penguin was just listed in the US last year because of concerns around climate change and sea ice. But at the moment, their population numbers are fairly robust, and they're not in need of breeding and reintroduction programs at this point. But as we see climate change increase its impact in the polar regions, that may in fact change over time.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. And that touches on a question that Andy had, which was, to what extent are penguin numbers holding steady or growing?
Yeah, it varies based on penguin and region. So we're seeing differential warming in the Antarctic. So the Antarctic Peninsula is one of the fastest warming places on the planet. And there, what we're seeing is two penguin species that are more reliant on krill and sea ice are having population declines. Adelie penguins are seeming to decline in that region extensively, whereas Gentoo penguins, which are more of a temperate penguin, they're sub-Antarctic penguin, they are increasing exponentially there. In fact, 50 years ago, you wouldn't see any on the peninsula, and now, as Justin knows, we've gone to huge colonies of them. One of the largest colonies is there at Cooverville, where we see a ton of Gentoos. So there we have sort of winners and losers. Of course, all of these species are dependent on the functioning of the Antarctic food web. And the Antarctic food web is highly dependent upon sea ice as a driver. The Philippe and the oceanography team will, I'm sure, give you lots of details on that. But if we see that food web start to suffer, we will see corresponding declines in the species that rely on it. One other thing that I will say is that censusing penguins in a lot of these remote regions has been a challenge, right? But with satellite imagery, we're actually finding a lot more penguin colonies that nobody even knew about because their poop shows up on satellite imagery. So we're able to find these colonies by looking at these guano patches that show up on satellite imagery. So the estimates, the global population estimates for Adelies, for example, have increased in recent years, but that's because we've found more colonies. That doesn't mean the colonies that we know about have increased in number.
Very interesting. In fact, we have a couple of other questions to that effect as well. Do you think Sharon and Susan are asking questions that are similar, I think, as well. With increasing climate change, how do you think penguins will further adapt? And I guess that's what you're referring to, that shift in species, geographic shift, some ranges increasing or moving, shifting.
Yeah. The moving thing, it works for the short term for a sub-Antarctic penguin moving further south, right?
Yeah.
But an Antarctic penguin doesn't have any further south to go, right?
Yeah.
So this is where you sort of have species that could potentially fall off a cliff and not adapt just with rain changes. In terms of evolutionary adaptation, there is some of that can happen in the short term in terms of bottlenecks for heat tolerance and that sort of thing. But with penguins, we have a very long-lived seabird here. A lot of seabirds have quite long lifespans because they live in a very stochastic environment. So there's a lot of changes that might happen over their lifespan. And that means there might be good years and there might be bad years. And because there's this good year, bad year reality to life at sea, you can have some penguins that might not breed for many, many years successfully, but then they get a good year and then they breed quite successfully. And for that to work, you need to have a relatively long lifespan. Also, they're a larger bird, they tend to have a longer lifespan. That longer lifespan is, when it comes to adaptation at a geological timescale, like an evolutionary timescale, is a disadvantage because your generation time is high. And that means with the speed that we're seeing climate change advance, it is unlikely that these species will be able to adapt genetically in that time frame, whereas they may, as we see, have some behavioral adaptations, typic plasticity, that's how genes are expressed in the shorter term. But personally, I am concerned about several of these species in the face of climate change. I can do a whole nother hour on, in fact, I do, when we go down there, I will do another hour on climate change and how it impacts these species and all of those different factors. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of concerns around that. And just like there are in the Arctic, these climate change disproportionately impacts the polar regions and therefore just disproportionately impacting the wildlife that lives there.
Great, thank you. In fact, Connie's asked a question very specifically, how long do penguins live? I think you sort of touched on that generally. How long do they live?
Yeah, again, depends on your species, but you're looking 20, 30 years for these species, so much longer than a little songbird.
Yeah, for sure. Donna is asking, how many different species of penguin can we expect to see when on the Magellan Explorer, which is this trip that's coming
depends
up?
if we get lucky with the Emperor again.
Yes.
Yeah, keep your eyes peeled all times. So we will see Magellanic penguins, we will see king penguins, macaroni, Gentoo, Adelie, chin strap, and then potentially emperor is if you're keeping your eyes peeled. We saw two on our last trip, which was really wonderful. You got to be on deck, keeping your
Yep,
eyes peeled.
I feel
Because if you
that's
see them in the water, the first one we saw was in the water and it dove, and then it can be down for half an hour, right?
yeah,
So, yeah.
one of their adaptations. Thank you.
Hmm.
We have a question actually related to emperor penguins. Ken is asking, how tall are emperor penguins? Of course, they're the biggest penguin.
Hmm. Taller than you'd think, about 4 feet tall. Like it depends on posture. If they put their head up and put their bill up, they're going to be taller and they're going to be about as tall as I am. They are a very big animal. They are not the largest penguin that's ever lived. There was a 6-foot penguin, 6.5 feet or so, that is an extinct species that fossils have been found for it. So it's quite a large bird.
Great, thank you. Now, Steve is asking an interesting adaptation question. How are penguins adapted for sound underwater? Or
Mm.
or do they not hear underwater?
They do hear underwater, but their prey doesn't usually emit sound. Their predators, however, might. So, for example, orcas will hunt penguins, so they can hear underwater. Whether their hearing is as good underwater as it on land, I suspect not. But they are not necessarily pursuing prey because of using sound.
Excellent, thank you for that. Very, very interesting. Yulia is asking, how many hours does it take to travel from Toronto to Antarctica? I think that's more a question for me. I think our trip that I'll mention again in a moment starts in Ushuaia at the southern tip of Argentina. To get there, we fly, if you're coming from Ontario, you fly from Toronto overnight to Buenos Aires. You probably have an overnight stay in Buenos Aires, or you could fly basically when you arrive directly to Ushuaia a few more hours. Argentina is a very, very long country. So you can count on 2 good travel days to get to Antarctica from Canada. All
And
right,
then once you're on, well,
go
the
ahead.
on the boat, like you have some time on the boat, but the boat time is great time because that's when all the albatross are out, right? The
Yes.
albatross, the whales. It's honestly like I love going to the penguin colonies, and I know that we're all here for the penguins, but I'm an albatross. I'm on team albatross, pretty firmly in
Okay.
terms of my favorites.
Yes.
And so those boat days are really exciting
Yeah.
because we're seeing all of those seabirds.
Yes. So we'll be, of course, embarking. Referring to the expedition here, we're going to be embarking in the southern tip of Argentina in Ushuaia, sailing across to the Falkland Islands to the northeast, spending a few days there before we set sail far to the east to the very isolated and wild island of South Georgia, where we have those largest colonies, among the largest colonies of king penguins in the world, and before we swing back around to um, to Antarctica proper, down south, and then we swing back up to South America. So that is our full circle voyage. You see the dates on your screen, and we'll stick in, if you're interested in joining our voyage, if you're not signed up for it, we will stick in the chat for this, in your GoToWebinar chat. You can learn more about the Antarctic expedition there. There's the link there if you want to click on that to view more information on this fantastic trip. It's booking up. So we would love to have you on board to learn much more about everything there, including the flying and the non-flying seabirds of Antarctica. So we do come to our door prizes. We had one advertised door prize, but in fact we have 2 door prizes. So if you don't get the first one, you have a second chance. And our first prize, I think very fittingly, is Penguins, the one you see on your screen, this fantastic book, Penguins, uh, which I will ask my colleague, Vishwa, who's working hard in the background to make everything work. Vishwa, can you please draw the winner of our first prize, this wonderful book? And the winner who's attending live is Darcy. So congratulations, Darcy. You get this copy of Penguins, the Ultimate Guide. And we have a secret second prize, which is this here, which is a CD, A Rose for Antarctica. It is a disc of Antarctica-inspired instrumental music. One of our listeners here today is a big fan of Antarctica, Valmo Kurl, and he and his colleague Michael have put together this, I believe it's a second CD of Antarctic-inspired music, and the winner of this disc is, and just get that, it's Lyle. Lyle, you can watch for that. And we'll get in touch to get your both of your mailing addresses to make sure we have them correctly. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. You can watch for the link to the recording of today's event, as well as the bonus second webinar from Catherine in your email in the coming couple of days. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much, Catherine, for taking time out of your day to tell us more about penguins and what makes them the world's perfect predators. Thank you.
Anytime. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.